"How did you get that uniform, old man?" The words would echo through Terminal B like a gunshot, but that confrontation was still 3 hours away. Right now, in the pre-dawn quiet of his Durham apartment, Commander Darius Washington was simply trying to remember who he used to be. The alarm had been unnecessary. Sleep rarely came easily anymore, and when it did, it brought dreams of Syrian sand and the moment everything changed. Darius sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the dress blue uniform hanging on his closet door, pressed and perfect, every ribbon and medal positioned exactly where regulation demanded. 25 years of service condensed into fabric and metal, a lifetime of purpose reduced to memory. At 52, Darius Washington had been many things. A scared 18-year-old from East Baltimore who saw the Navy as his only escape from streets that swallowed young men whole. A determined recruit who survived the brutal crucible of SEAL training when instructors told him he didn't belong. A warrior who'd earned his place through sheer will and unbreakable discipline. A leader who'd commanded respect in the most elite military units in the world. But 18 months ago, an IED buried in a Syrian doorway had reduced him to something he was still learning to accept: a disabled veteran in a wheelchair, struggling to find meaning in a world that seemed to have moved on without him. The prosthetic leg leaned against his nightstand, a constant reminder of what he'd lost. Some mornings he forgot. Some mornings he'd wake up and reach for the floor with his right foot only to encounter empty space and the crushing weight of reality. Today wasn't one of those mornings. Today he was acutely aware of every absence, every limitation, every way his body had betrayed him. But today was also the day he was finally going to see Jasmine. His daughter's graduation from the University of Washington pre-med program was next week, and she'd been begging him to visit for months. "Daddy, I need you here," she'd said during their last video call, her voice carrying that mixture of love and concern that made his chest tight. "I need to see you. Not on a screen, not in a photo. I need my father here with me." Darius had made excuses for months. The logistics were complicated. Flying was difficult with his disabilities. He needed more time to adjust. But the truth was simpler and more painful. He was ashamed. Ashamed of the wheelchair, ashamed of his weakness, ashamed that the daughter he'd taught to be strong might now see him as broken. Jasmine had been 12 when he deployed for the last time, a bright-eyed girl who worshipped her father and wrote him letters about honor and service and coming home safely. He'd promised her he would, and he had kept that promise technically. He'd come home alive. But the man who'd left wasn't the same one who'd returned, and the weight of that difference had kept him isolated in this small apartment, avoiding mirrors and conversations and anything that reminded him of who he used to be. The uniform still fit perfectly. Muscle memory guided his hands through the familiar routine of dressing each movement precise and automatic, despite the modifications he'd had to make for the wheelchair. When he looked in the mirror, he saw Commander Darius Washington, decorated Navy SEAL Purple Heart recipient. For just a moment, the wheelchair disappeared. For just a moment, he was whole again. The drive to Raleigh-Durham International Airport took 40 minutes through morning traffic that moved with surprising efficiency. Darius had loaded his wheelchair into his modified van with practiced movements, though he still hated the attention it drew. People stared with that mixture of pity and curiosity that made him want to disappear. Some thanked him for his service in grocery store checkout lines, their voices carrying that peculiar tone people used when they weren't sure what else to say. He always responded politely, but inside he wondered if they could see the fraud he felt, like the hero who couldn't even climb stairs anymore. The airport was busy for a Tuesday morning, filled with business travelers and families and the constant hum of people going places he'd once taken for granted. Darius checked in at the counter without incident. The agent was professional and courteous, thanked him for his service, and even arranged for priority boarding. Everything was proceeding smoothly, exactly as it should. He had no way of knowing that in just a few hours his faith in human decency would be shattered by a woman with platinum blonde hair and a badge that gave her just enough authority to destroy someone's dignity. He had no way of knowing that his humiliation would be witnessed by 50 strangers recorded on multiple phones and transformed into a moment that would change everything. And he certainly had no way of knowing that his salvation would come from a 9-year-old girl with dark eyes and an unshakable belief that silence in the face of cruelty was its own kind of betrayal. 3 terminals away in the first-class check-in area reserved for the airline's most valued customers, Zara Monroe was saying goodbye to the family driver with the same composed politeness she applied to everything else in her 9-year-old life. "Thank you, William," she said, adjusting the straps of her small backpack with careful precision. "Please tell my parents I arrived safely and will call them once I'm settled at grandmother's house." William Jackson, who'd been driving for the Monroe family for 8 years, still found himself amazed by this child's unusual maturity. Most 9-year-olds would be bouncing with excitement or anxiety about flying alone across the country. Zara stood perfectly still, her dark eyes taking in the bustling terminal with the kind of calculated awareness that reminded him of her father during high-stakes business negotiations. The Monroe family wasn't just wealthy. They were powerful in ways that most people couldn't comprehend. Dominic Monroe had built Monroe Global Enterprises from nothing, transforming a small investment firm into a $50 billion empire that influenced markets around the world. Dr. Naomi Monroe had spent 12 years as a federal prosecutor, taking down corrupt politicians and criminal organizations with the kind of methodical precision that made powerful people very nervous. Together, they'd created a life of extraordinary privilege, but they'd also made sure their daughter understood that privilege came with responsibility. This morning's emergency departures were perfect examples of that responsibility in action. Dominic had been called to New York for a board meeting that could affect thousands of jobs across 3 companies. Naomi was testifying before a congressional committee about prison reform, using her expertise to advocate for people who had no voice in the halls of power. They'd debated canceling Zara's trip to visit her grandmother in Seattle, but she'd insisted she could travel alone. "I've flown dozens of times," she'd reminded them with characteristic logic. "I know the procedures, I have all the documentation I need, and grandmother will meet me at the gate. There's no logical reason to postpone the visit just because you have obligations." Her parents had exchanged one of those glances that passed between them when they were reminded of how unusual their daughter was. Most children her age couldn't be trusted to remember their lunch boxes, but Zara had been managing her own schedule and responsibilities since she was 6 years old. She didn't just act older than her age. She thought older, reasoned older, and carried herself with a dignity that made adults forget they were talking to a child. The lessons that had shaped her were woven into every interaction she'd witnessed between her parents and the world around them. Dominic had taught her that real power wasn't about domination or control. It was about using your resources and influence to create positive change. He'd shown her that strength came from discipline, that respect was earned through consistent action, and that the most important battles weren't fought with anger or aggression, but with intelligence and moral clarity. Naomi had taught her that justice wasn't something that happened in courtrooms or legislative buildings. It was something that had to be chosen moment by people who were willing to stand up when they saw something wrong. She'd explained that being a witness to cruelty without acting made you complicit in that cruelty, that silence was a choice that carried its own moral weight. Both parents had been crystal clear about the reality they navigated as a successful Black family in America. The looks, the assumptions, the constant need to prove they belonged in spaces where their presence challenged other people's expectations. They'd taught Zara to see these moments clearly, to understand the difference between individual prejudice and institutional bias, and to respond with strategic intelligence rather than emotional reaction. "The world will try to make you feel small," Naomi had told her just last week, echoing words that generations of Black parents had spoken to their children. "But you must never let them succeed. You carry yourself with dignity, not because you have to prove anything to anyone, but because dignity is yours by right, and no one can take it from you unless you let them. At 9 years old, Zara had internalized these lessons so completely that they shaped her every interaction. She spoke carefully, thinking through her words before she said them. She observed people closely, reading body language and tone for the things they weren't saying. She asked questions that made adults uncomfortable because they revealed contradictions and hypocrisies that most people preferred to ignore. Now, walking through the terminal toward her gate, she moved with the same quiet confidence she brought to everything else. Her navy dress was perfectly pressed, her white sneakers spotless, her natural hair pulled back in 2 neat puffs that framed her face. She looked like exactly what she was, a well-cared-for child from a loving family. But there was something in her posture, something in the way she carried herself that suggested depths that most adults wouldn't expect. She found gate 23, easily checked the departure board to confirm her flight was on time, and settled into a chair with a clear view of the boarding area. From her backpack, she pulled out a biography of Thurgood Marshall that she was reading for a school project on civil rights leaders. The book fascinated her particularly, Marshall's strategy of using the law itself to dismantle the legal foundations of segregation. He'd understood that lasting change required more than individual victories. It required changing the structures that allowed injustice to flourish. As she read, Zara was peripherally aware of the controlled chaos around her. Business travelers typing frantically on laptops, families corralling excited children, elderly passengers settling into wheelchairs for assistance. It was a familiar tableau, one she'd observed dozens of times during her travels with her parents. But something about the energy in the terminal felt different today, though she couldn't quite identify what was causing her unease. The feeling would prove prophetic. In less than an hour, Zara Monroe would witness an act of cruelty that demanded a response. She would be forced to choose between the safety of silence and the risk of speaking truth to power. And in that moment, all of her parents' lessons about dignity, justice, and moral courage would converge into a decision that would change not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who witnessed what happened next. Crystal Blake arrived at Gate 23 with the kind of purposeful stride that announced her authority to anyone paying attention. At 45, she carried herself like a woman who'd learned that the world respected power more than kindness, and she'd spent the last 12 years of her airline career building a reputation for being someone you didn't cross. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in a style that was both professional and severe, framing sharp features that could shift from customer service smile to bureaucratic stone in seconds. The uniform fit her perfectly pressed and pristine, with a name tag that caught the terminal lights and reminded everyone who approached her podium exactly who was in charge of their travel destiny. Crystal had grown up in Akron, Ohio, in a house where money was always tight and respect was something you fought for every single day. Her father had worked at a rubber plant until the factory closed, spending his last years doing odd jobs that never paid enough to cover the bills. Her mother had waitressed at a diner, coming home every night with swollen feet and stories about customers who treated her like she was invisible. Crystal had watched her parents shrink a little more each year, worn down by a world that seemed designed to remind them they didn't matter. The airline job had been her escape from that powerlessness. For the first time in her life, Crystal Blake was in charge of something. She stood behind a podium and people had to listen to her. They had to follow her instructions, answer her questions, submit to her authority. If they wanted to get on that plane, they had to go through her, and she'd learned to use that power in ways that made her feel significant. Over the years, Crystal had developed what she thought of as an instinct for reading people, though it was really just a sophisticated system of prejudice disguised as professional judgment. She could spot the passengers who would cause problems, the ones who thought they were entitled to special treatment, the ones who needed to be reminded that she was in control. Elderly immigrants who didn't speak English perfectly. single mothers traveling with multiple children, young men who looked like they might be flying on tickets they couldn't really afford, and especially people who didn't look like they belonged in first class. Crystal's methods had been refined through years of practice. She never used obvious slurs or made explicitly racist statements that could get her in trouble. Instead, she questioned documentation just a little too thoroughly, enforced rules just a little too strictly, and created just enough bureaucratic friction to make certain passengers understand they weren't welcome. Management rarely questioned her decisions because she always had plausible explanations: security concerns, policy violations, procedural requirements, the language of institutional authority that made discrimination sound like diligence. Her colleague Jason Rivera had tried to talk to her about it once after a particularly ugly incident involving an elderly Vietnamese woman who'd missed her flight because Crystal had refused to accept her documentation. That seemed kind of harsh, he'd said carefully, and Crystal had given him the look that made junior employees back down. "You're not paid to question my judgment," she'd told him. "You're paid to do your job. I suggest you focus on that." Jason had never brought it up again, and neither had anyone else. Crystal had learned that most people would rather look away than confront injustice, especially when that injustice was wrapped in bureaucratic language and delivered by someone in uniform. She'd built her entire professional identity around that understanding. This morning's passenger manifest included the usual mix of business travelers, families, and what Crystal thought of as potential problems. Her eyes lingered on certain names, certain seat assignments, already planning how she'd handle any issues that arose. She didn't know yet that one of those names belonged to a decorated war veteran who'd sacrificed his body in service to his country. She didn't know that another belonged to the daughter of one of the most powerful families in America. But she did know that in just over an hour she'd have the chance to exercise her authority over both of them, and she was looking forward to it. The morning proceeded according to routine. Early passengers began arriving at the gate, settling into seats and checking phones and reading books. Crystal processed upgrades and seat changes with efficient professionalism, her demeanor shifting subtly based on her assessment of each passenger's status and potential compliance. The businesswoman in the expensive suit got a warm smile and immediate attention. The young man with the worn backpack got clipped responses and unnecessary questions about his documentation. Crystal had perfected the art of graduated hostility, applying just enough pressure to establish dominance without crossing lines that would trigger formal complaints. She'd learned exactly how far she could push different types of passengers, how much discomfort she could inflict while maintaining plausible deniability. The system protected her as long as she followed the unwritten rules of institutionalized cruelty. But systems can be broken by people who refuse to accept them, and in less than an hour, Crystal Blake would encounter a 9-year-old girl who had been raised to believe that dignity was non-negotiable, and that silence in the face of injustice was its own kind of betrayal. The encounter would strip away every justification Crystal had built around her behavior, expose every rationalization she'd used to avoid confronting what she'd become. It would force her to see herself through the eyes of someone who had never learned to accept cruelty as normal, never been taught that powerlessness was permanent, never believed that authority was more important than humanity. And it would change everything. The first sign of trouble wasn't dramatic. It was just a slight shift in Crystal Blake's posture as Commander Darius Washington approached her podium, the kind of subtle change that predators make when they sense opportunity. She'd been processing boarding passes with mechanical efficiency for the past hour, but something about the man in the wheelchair made her straighten with renewed attention. Darius maneuvered his chair through the crowd with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate spaces that weren't designed for him. His dress blue uniform was immaculate, every ribbon and medal positioned exactly according to regulation, the fabric crisp, despite the long morning of travel. He held his boarding pass and military ID in steady hands. though Crystal wouldn't have noticed the slight tremor that betrayed his nervousness about flying for the first time since his injury. "Good morning," Darius said as he reached the podium, his voice carrying the respectful authority of someone accustomed to military protocol. "I'm Commander Washington. I have priority boarding and requested wheelchair assistance." Crystal looked down at him with an expression that might have passed for professional interest if you weren't paying attention to her eyes. But Zara Monroe, sitting 30 feet away with her biography of Thurgood Marshall, was paying very close attention indeed. She noticed the way Crystal's gaze lingered on Darius's face, then dropped to the wheelchair, then back to the uniform, with something that looked like suspicion. "Priority boarding." Crystal repeated slowly, as if the words themselves were questionable. She picked up his documents with deliberate casualness, holding them at arm's length like they might be contaminated. And who authorized that? The question hit Darius like a small slap. He'd been traveling on military credentials for over 2 decades, and priority boarding for disabled veterans was standard policy at every major airline. The agent at check-in confirmed it when I requested wheelchair assistance, he said, confusion creeping into his voice. "I was told it was automatic for disabled veterans." Crystal's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. "Automatic," she repeated, loading the word with disdain. "Nothing's automatic, sir. Especially when there are questions about documentation." She held up his military ID, squinting at it, as if examining a suspected forgery. Darius watched with growing alarm as she turned the card over in her hands, comparing the photo to his face with exaggerated scrutiny. Around them, other passengers were beginning to notice the interaction, though most were still pretending to be absorbed in their phones and books. "This photo doesn't really look like you," Crystal said finally, her voice loud enough to carry to nearby seats. "How old is this ID?" "It's current," Darius replied, his training, keeping his voice level despite the humiliation burning in his chest. "I was honorably discharged 18 months ago. Everything is up to date." Somehow managed to sound dismissive. And somehow managed to sound dismissive. "And this uniform. Where did you get it?" The question froze Darius's blood. In all his years of service and all his interactions with civilians and officials and bureaucrats, no one had ever questioned his right to wear the uniform he'd earned through sacrifice and service. "I earned it," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You earned it," Crystal repeated, her tone suggesting the opposite. She leaned forward slightly, and Darius caught a whiff of coffee and something else, something that smelled like malicious satisfaction. "Or did you buy it online? You can get anything these days. Military uniforms, fake IDs, Purple Hearts from eBay." The words hit him like physical blows. Darius felt his chest tighten, felt the familiar symptoms of a panic attack beginning to build in the margins of his consciousness. Box breathing, he told himself. 4 counts in 4 counts, hold 4 counts out. The technique that had saved his life in combat situations now struggled to keep him functional in the face of bureaucratic cruelty. "Ma'am," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "I served for 25 years. I was wounded in Syria. I lost my leg defending this country. I have documentation, medical records, discharge papers. Whatever you need to verify my service, I can provide." Crystal's eyes glittered with something that might have been pleasure. "That's what they all say," she told him loud enough for half the gate area to hear. "You'd be amazed how many people try to game the system. Fake veterans, stolen valor, whatever gets them special treatment." Zara Monroe looked up from her book. The conversation had reached a volume and tone that made it impossible to ignore, and something about the exchange was making her stomach clench with familiar anger. She'd seen this before, this particular kind of cruelty that hid behind authority and procedure. Her mother had prosecuted cases involving exactly this kind of institutional abuse, and her father had faced similar challenges when people questioned whether a black man could really be the CEO of a billion-dollar company. Sir Crystal continued, her voice taking on a mock official tone that fooled no one. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while I verify your documentation. There are procedures for handling suspicious credentials." Suspicious, Darius repeated the word, falling from his lips like something toxic. He looked down at his hands, at the Purple Heart ribbon on his chest, at the wheelchair that had become both his reality and his shame. "What exactly is suspicious about my credentials?" Crystal's smile was razor thin. "Well, for starters, this uniform is awfully clean for someone who's been in combat. Most real veterans I've seen look a little more worn around the edges. And honestly," she paused, seeming to savor the moment, "you people are always trying to get something for nothing." The silence that followed was deafening. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something so shocking that it seemed to suck all other noise from the air. Passengers stopped their conversations mid-sentence. The businesswoman in 1A looked up from her laptop with her mouth slightly open. The college student with the worn backpack paused with his phone halfway to his ear. "You people." The phrase hung in the air like smoke, visible and toxic and impossible to ignore. Darius felt something break inside his chest, some last vestige of faith in human decency that had survived war and injury and months of depression. He'd been called worse things in his life, faced more obvious racism and more dangerous circumstances, but somehow this felt different. This felt like being stripped naked in public, like having every sacrifice and service and moment of honor reduced to a racist stereotype delivered by a woman with a badge and the institutional power to humiliate him without consequences. "I didn't." He started to say, then stopped. Because what was the point? What was the point of defending himself to someone who'd already decided he was guilty of being black in uniform, of taking up space? He didn't deserve of existing in a way that challenged her assumptions about who got to be a hero. Crystal leaned back, satisfied with the impact of her words. She'd drawn blood-established dominance and reminded everyone watching that she was in control. The man in the wheelchair could complain all he wanted, but she had the power to make his life difficult, and they both knew it. But what Crystal didn't know, what she couldn't have predicted, was that among the passengers witnessing her casual cruelty was a 9-year-old girl who had been raised to believe that silence in the face of injustice was its own kind of betrayal. A child who had been taught that dignity was non-negotiable, and that power without accountability was just another form of cowardice. Zara Monroe closed her book with a soft snap that somehow seemed louder than Crystal's voice. She stood up from her chair with the kind of fluid motion that suggested complete certainty about what came next. And as she began walking toward the podium where a decorated veteran sat in his wheelchair absorbing public humiliation from a woman who had never risked anything for anyone, the energy in Gate 23 shifted in ways that no one could have predicted. The reckoning was about to begin. From her seat 30 feet away, Zara Monroe had been watching the exchange between Crystal Blake and Commander Washington with the kind of focused attention that most adults reserved for emergency situations. But for Zara, this was an emergency. Not the kind that involved sirens and ambulances, but the kind that required immediate moral intervention before something irreversible happened to another human being's dignity. Her parents had taught her to read people the way other children learned to read books. Body language told stories that words often tried to hide. Tone of voice revealed intentions that polite phrases attempted to disguise. And what Zara was seeing at Gate 23 was a story she'd witnessed before, a story that always ended the same way unless someone chose to change the ending. Crystal Blake's posture radiated predatory satisfaction. She stood behind her podium like a spider in the center of a web, feeding on the discomfort she was creating. Her shoulders were squared, her chin slightly raised, her eyes bright with the kind of pleasure that came from exercising power over someone she perceived as vulnerable. Every gesture was calculated to establish dominance and strip away dignity. Commander Washington's body language told a different story entirely. His military bearing was still evident in the straightness of his spine and the careful positioning of his hands, but Zara could see the subtle signs of a man being systematically broken down, the slight tremor in his fingers, the way his breathing had become shallow and controlled, the rigid set of his jaw that suggested he was fighting to maintain composure in the face of public humiliation. Around them, the other passengers were displaying the full spectrum of human response to witnessed injustice. Some looked genuinely disturbed by what they were hearing. A woman in a business suit had stopped typing on her laptop and was staring at the exchange with obvious discomfort. An elderly man was shaking his head with disgust. A teenager had pulled out her phone and appeared to be recording, though she was trying to be discreet about it. But most of the passengers were doing what people usually did when confronted with cruelty that wasn't directly affecting them. They were looking away, finding suddenly urgent emails to check, becoming intensely interested in departure boards and book pages and anything else that would allow them to avoid the moral obligation of witnessing what was happening. Zara understood this response better than most children her age because her mother had explained it to her in terms that made sense. People tell themselves that getting involved will make things worse. Dr. Naomi Monroe had said during one of their conversations about justice and responsibility. They convince themselves that it's not their place to intervene, that someone else will speak up, that the situation will resolve itself. But what they're really afraid of is the discomfort of taking a stand. The discomfort was certainly evident now. Passengers were shifting in their seats, avoiding eye contact, creating the kind of collective silence that enabled cruelty to flourish. They were waiting for someone else to act, for some authority figure to appear and restore order for the uncomfortable moment to pass, so they could return to their normal routines. But Zara had been raised to understand that normal routines were built on the assumption that someone else would handle the difficult moral decisions. Her parents had taught her that privilege without responsibility was just another form of selfishness, that having advantages meant having obligations, that watching injustice without acting made you complicit in that injustice. You people are always trying to get something for nothing. Crystal's words cut through the terminal noise like a blade, and Zara felt her chest tighten with a familiar anger. Not the hot, chaotic anger that led to poor decisions, but the cold, focused anger that her parents had taught her to channel into action. She'd heard variations of those words before directed at her father during business meetings, where people questioned whether a black man could really have built a multi-billion-dollar company. Directed at her mother during court proceedings, where defense attorneys tried to suggest that a black woman couldn't possibly understand complex legal issues. The phrase "you people" was linguistic violence, a way of reducing someone to a stereotype while maintaining plausible deniability. It was the kind of carefully coded language that allowed people to express their prejudices while claiming they weren't really being racist, just practical or observant, or concerned about procedure. Zara had watched Crystal Blake's technique evolve over the course of the interaction, each escalation carefully calibrated to inflict maximum humiliation while maintaining the appearance of professional conduct. First, the unnecessary questioning of documentation that was clearly valid. Then the suggestion that the uniform might be stolen or fake. Finally, the explicitly racist assumption that a black veteran was probably trying to cheat the system. It was a masterclass in institutional cruelty, the kind of bureaucratic torture that left no physical marks but could destroy someone's faith in human decency. And it was happening in public with dozens of witnesses, because Crystal Blake had correctly calculated that most people would choose comfort over courage, silence over accountability. But Zara Monroe had not been raised to choose comfort. She set her book down carefully, marking her place with the boarding pass that would take her to Seattle to visit her grandmother. The biography of Thurgood Marshall seemed particularly relevant now, given what she was about to do. Marshall had understood that changing unjust systems required people willing to confront them directly to put their own comfort at risk in service of something larger than themselves. As Zara stood up from her chair, she felt the weight of every lesson her parents had ever taught her about dignity and justice and the responsibility that came with privilege. She thought about her father building his business empire while facing constant questions about his legitimacy. She thought about her mother prosecuting powerful people who thought they were untouchable because of their position and connections. She thought about all the times they'd told her that having advantages meant having the obligation to use them on behalf of people who didn't have the same protections. The walk from her seat to Crystal Blake's podium felt both endless and instantaneous. Each step carried the weight of a decision that would change everything, not just for Commander Washington, but for everyone who was choosing to witness this moment rather than prevent it. Zara could feel eyes turning toward her as she moved through the crowd, could sense the shift in energy that came when people realized something significant was about to happen. She wasn't nervous exactly. Her parents had prepared her for moments like this, had given her the tools and the confidence to speak truth to power when the situation demanded it. But she was aware of the magnitude of what she was about to do, the way her words would ripple outward from this gate through social media and news coverage and conversations that would happen in living rooms and boardrooms across the country. By the time she reached Commander Washington's wheelchair, Crystal Blake was in the middle of explaining why additional documentation would be required to verify his service record. The bureaucratic language flowed smoothly, each procedure and requirement delivered with the kind of authority that made resistance seem futile. Zara positioned herself slightly to Commander Washington's left, where she could face Crystal Blake directly, while remaining visible to the growing audience of passengers who had stopped pretending they weren't watching. She stood perfectly still for a moment, her dark eyes locked on the gate agent's face, her small frame somehow radiating the kind of presence that made adults pay attention. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear and steady, carrying just enough volume to reach every corner of Gate 23, without seeming to be raised in anger. The words that came out of her mouth would be recorded on multiple phones, shared millions of times across social media platforms, and quoted in congressional hearings about discrimination in the airline industry. But in that moment, they were simply the voice of a 9-year-old girl who had decided that silence was no longer an option. "Don't talk to him like that." The words cut through the gate area with surgical precision, delivered in a voice that was calm, clear, and completely unafraid. Zara Monroe stood beside Commander Washington's wheelchair like a small sentinel, her dark eyes fixed on Crystal Blake, with the kind of steady gaze that made the gate agent blink in surprise. Crystal looked down at the child with the irritation of someone whose authority had been questioned by an obviously inferior person. Her professional smile tightened into something that resembled customer service, but felt like a threat. "I'm sorry, little girl, but this is adult business. Please return to your seat." "No," Zara said simply, and the single word carried more authority than Crystal's entire speech about procedures and verification. "This became my business the moment you decided to humiliate a veteran in public." The terminal seemed to hold its breath. Passengers who had been trying to ignore the confrontation now found themselves unable to look away. Phones appeared in hands with casual stealth recording devices angled to capture what everyone sensed was becoming something extraordinary. A 9-year-old girl was facing down an adult with institutional power, and nobody was sure what would happen next. Crystal's customer service mask slipped entirely. "Little girl, I don't know who you think you are, but you need to go back to your parents right now before I call security." "My parents aren't here," Zara replied evenly. "But if they were, they'd be proud of me for speaking up when I saw someone being treated with deliberate cruelty." She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd like snow. "They taught me that silence in the face of injustice makes you part of the problem." Commander Washington looked up at the child standing beside his wheelchair with something approaching wonder. In 25 years of military service, he'd seen acts of physical courage that took his breath away. Soldiers running into gunfire to save their teammates. sailors diving into stormy seas to rescue strangers. But he'd rarely witnessed the kind of moral courage that was radiating from this small girl who had decided to stand between him and institutional cruelty. Crystal leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow managed to carry venom. "You're just a child. You don't understand what's happening here. This man could be anyone. These uniforms can be bought online. These credentials can be faked. I have a responsibility to verify everything. You verified nothing," Zara said, her voice still calm but now edged with steel. "You looked at his military ID for exactly 3 seconds and declared it suspicious. You questioned the authenticity of his uniform based on nothing except your own assumptions. You accused him of stolen valor without even asking for his service records." She took a small step forward, and somehow the gesture made her seem taller. "And you did all of this because you saw a black man in a wheelchair and decided he was probably lying." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Several passengers pulled out their phones, no longer pretending to be discreet about recording. The businessman in 4C muttered something that sounded like "holy shit" under his breath. The elderly woman in 2A nodded approvingly and said, "That's right, baby. Tell her." Crystal's face flushed red, whether from anger or embarrassment or the sudden realization that her carefully maintained professional facade was crumbling in real time. "I never said anything about race. I treat all passengers equally. I have procedures I'm required to follow. You told him you people are always trying to get something for nothing." Zara said, her voice carrying to every corner of the gate area. "Everyone here heard it. Most of them are recording it. You can't pretend you didn't say it, and you can't pretend it wasn't a racist comment designed to humiliate someone you thought was powerless to fight back." The silence that followed was deafening. 50 passengers sat frozen watching a 9-year-old girl systematically dismantle an adult's justifications for institutional cruelty. Crystal opened her mouth and closed it, then opened it again without producing any sound. For the first time in 12 years of gate agent work, she found herself completely without words. Zara filled the silence with the kind of moral clarity that comes from being raised to see injustice clearly and respond to it immediately. Commander Washington earned that uniform through 25 years of service to this country. He lost his leg defending the freedom that allows you to question his service without fear of government retaliation. Those medals on his chest represent sacrifice and honor and dedication that most people will never understand. She gestured to the ribbons on Darius's uniform, her voice growing stronger with each word. "That Purple Heart means he was wounded in combat while protecting American interests overseas. That Navy Cross means he displayed extraordinary heroism in the face of enemy action. That Silver Star means he showed gallantry that went above and beyond the call of duty. And you looked at all of that and decided it was probably fake because a black man in a wheelchair didn't fit your idea of what a hero looks like." Commander Washington felt tears building behind his eyes. But for the first time in 18 months, they weren't tears of shame or frustration. They were tears of recognition of being seen and defended by someone who understood the value of what he'd sacrificed. This child was giving voice to everything he'd been unable to articulate, translating his pain into language that demanded accountability. That uniform wasn't given to him. Zara continued, her voice now carrying the kind of authority that made adults forget they were listening to a child. It was earned through dedication and discipline and sacrifice. It was paid for with pain and blood and pieces of his body that he'll never get back. And you treated it like a costume, like something he put on to trick you into giving him special treatment. Crystal tried to interrupt. "I was just following procedures. I have a responsibility to verify suspicious documentation. What was suspicious about it?" Zara asked, her tone shifting into the kind of prosecutorial precision she'd learned from watching her mother in courtroom videos. "His military ID is current and valid. His boarding pass clearly shows priority boarding privileges." His discharge paperwork, which I'm sure he has with him, would confirm everything he's told you. But you didn't ask to see any additional documentation. You just decided he was lying and started treating him like a criminal. The crowd was growing restless, not with boredom, but with the kind of uncomfortable energy that comes when people realize they're witnessing something that will be remembered long after it's over. Some passengers were nodding along with Zara's words. Others looked ashamed of their earlier silence. A few were already typing on their phones, sharing video clips and outraged commentary with their social media networks. "Apologize to him." Zara said the words carrying the weight of a command rather than a request. Apologize for questioning his service, for suggesting his uniform was fake, for treating him like a liar and a fraud. Apologize for reducing a decorated combat veteran to a racist stereotype. Apologize now publicly in front of everyone who witnessed your cruelty. Crystal Blake stared at the child who had just stripped away every defense and justification she'd built around her behavior over the past 12 years. This 9-year-old girl had seen through the bureaucratic language and professional authority to the simple, ugly truth underneath. Crystal had used her position to humiliate someone she saw as vulnerable, and she'd done it because she could. The silence stretched between them like a tightrope, with 50 passengers balanced on the tension of waiting to see what would happen next. Crystal could feel the weight of all those eyes, all those recording phones, all that judgment pressing down on her like a physical force. For the first time in her career, Crystal Blake was the one without power. She was the one being held accountable. She was the one whose dignity was on the line. And the person demanding that accountability was a 9-year-old girl who understood something that Crystal had forgotten long ago, that real authority comes not from the ability to harm others, but from the courage to stand up when you see harm being done. The silence at Gate 23 had weight now pressing down on Crystal Blake, like the accumulated judgment of every passenger who had watched her systematic destruction of a combat veteran's dignity. 50 pairs of eyes waited for her response to a 9-year-old girl's demand for basic human decency. And Crystal found herself in territory she had never navigated before: complete moral accountability. Zara Monroe stood perfectly still beside Commander Washington's wheelchair, her small frame radiating the kind of unshakable certainty that comes from knowing you are absolutely right. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't threatened or pleaded or bargained. She had simply spoken truth with surgical precision, cutting through layers of bureaucratic justification to expose the raw cruelty underneath. "Everyone is waiting," Zara said quietly, her dark eyes never leaving Crystal's face. "Everyone is watching. Everyone is recording. You have a choice to make right now that will define who you are as a human being. You can apologize for what you did to Commander Washington, or you can continue trying to justify the unjustifiable." Crystal felt her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of her podium. In 12 years of gate agent work, she had never been cornered like this, never had her authority questioned so completely by someone she couldn't dismiss or intimidate. Children were supposed to be powerless, easily managed with adult authority and bureaucratic procedure. But this child was wielding moral authority that made Crystal's institutional power feel hollow and meaningless. "You don't understand the pressures I'm under," Crystal said, her voice cracking slightly. "I have quotas to meet, procedures to follow, supervisors breathing down my neck. Sometimes people try to game the system, and I have to be careful about who gets special treatment." "Stop," Zara said the single word cutting through Crystal's justifications like a blade. "Stop trying to make this about procedures and policies and pressures from supervisors. This is about how you chose to treat another human being. This is about the words that came out of your mouth and the pain you deliberately inflicted on someone who served this country with honor." Commander Washington felt something shifting inside his chest as he listened to this child systematically dismantle every excuse for the cruelty he'd endured. For 18 months he'd been internalizing the message that his pain didn't matter, that his service was somehow diminished by his disability, that he should be grateful for whatever scraps of respect people chose to throw his way. But Zara's words were rebuilding something in him that Crystal's cruelty had tried to destroy. You looked at Commander Washington and made a series of assumptions based entirely on his race and his disability. Zara continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. You decided that a black man in a wheelchair couldn't possibly have earned the uniform he was wearing, or the medals on his chest. You decided that his documentation was probably fake. His service record probably fabricated his sacrifice, probably exaggerated. Passengers around the gate were leaning forward now, completely absorbed in watching a 9-year-old girl deliver a masterclass in moral clarity. The businessman in 4C had closed his laptop and was recording openly. The elderly woman in 2A was wiping tears from her eyes. The college student with the worn backpack was live streaming the confrontation to his social media followers with commentary that was already going viral. And when he tried to explain his service, when he showed you documentation that would have satisfied any reasonable person, you escalated your cruelty, Zara said, her voice taking on the kind of prosecutorial precision she'd learned from watching her mother. You told him his uniform was too clean to be real. You suggested he'd bought it online like a costume. You accused him of stolen valor, one of the most serious accusations you can make against a veteran. Crystal tried to interrupt. I was just being thorough. Security is important in airports. We have to be careful about false documentation. You were being cruel. Zara corrected her calm certainty, making Crystal's excuses sound pathetic. You were using your position to humiliate someone you perceived as vulnerable. And you did it because you've learned that most people will stay silent when they see injustice happening, that most passengers will look away rather than get involved, that most institutions will protect their employees rather than their customers. The truth of that statement hit the crowd like cold water. Many of the passengers who were now recording and commenting and expressing outrage had spent the first 10 minutes of the confrontation trying to avoid getting involved. They had been hoping someone else would speak up, someone else would intervene, someone else would take the risk of confronting institutional authority. But the worst part, Zara continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the gate area, was when you said, you people are always trying to get something for nothing. Because that's when you stopped pretending this was about procedures and revealed what it was really about. Racism. Pure, simple, ugly racism directed at a man who has given more to this country than most people ever will. The phrase hung in the air like poison gas, visible and toxic and impossible to ignore. Crystal had said it, everyone had heard it, and no amount of backtracking or explanation could make it disappear. The words had revealed the true motivation behind her treatment of Commander Washington, stripping away the professional facade to expose the prejudice underneath. So apologize, Zara said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute moral authority. Not because I'm telling you to. Not because people are recording. Not because you might get in trouble with your supervisors. Apologize because what you did was wrong, and acknowledging wrongdoing is the first step toward becoming a better human being. Crystal looked around the gate area, desperately searching for some escape from the moral corner she'd been backed into. But every face she saw reflected the same expectation that she would do the right thing finally after 12 years of doing the wrong thing with institutional protection. The teenager with the purple hair was holding her phone steady, live streaming the confrontation to thousands of viewers. The businessman was typing rapidly on his laptop, probably composing an email to the airline's corporate headquarters. The elderly couple was watching with the kind of quiet dignity that suggested they had experienced similar treatment themselves. Crystal started, then stopped, the word catching in her throat like a stone. She looked down at Commander Washington, really seeing him for the first time. Not a problem to be managed or a stereotype to be dismissed, but a human being who had served with honor and was now sitting in a wheelchair absorbing public humiliation from someone who had never risked anything for anyone. I'm sorry, she whispered the words, barely audible, Louder, Zara said gently, so everyone can hear, so Commander Washington can hear, so it means something. Crystal closed her eyes, took a shaking breath, and spoke the words that would end her 12-year career of institutional cruelty. I'm sorry, Commander Washington. I'm sorry for questioning your service, for suggesting your uniform was fake, for treating you like a criminal instead of a hero. I was wrong, and you didn't deserve any of what I put you through. Commander Darius Washington looked up at the woman who had just publicly apologized for trying to destroy his dignity, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 18 months, the restoration of his fundamental humanity. Not forgiveness, not yet, but acknowledgement, recognition, the simple, powerful validation that his pain mattered and his service was real. He nodded once, a gesture that contained more grace than Crystal Blake had any right to expect. And in Gate 23, Terminal B, something fundamental shifted in the moral atmosphere. A 9-year-old girl had forced accountability from institutional authority. A decorated veteran had received the respect he'd always deserved, and 50 strangers had witnessed proof that individual courage could still triumph over bureaucratic cruelty. The applause started slowly, just one person clapping, then another, then a rolling wave of approval that filled the gate area with the sound of people celebrating something they had almost given up believing, in the possibility that justice could still prevail when someone was brave enough to demand it. The applause was still echoing through Gate 23, when Janet Torres, the senior gate supervisor, appeared at Crystal's elbow with a tablet in her hand and an expression of barely controlled panic on her face. She had been monitoring the situation from the departure lounge office, watching through security cameras as one of her agents engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly volatile confrontation with passengers. Crystal Janet whispered urgently, her voice tight with professional anxiety. "We need to talk. Now." But Crystal couldn't move. She stood behind her podium like someone who had just survived a natural disaster, staring at the 9-year-old girl who had just dismantled her entire worldview in under 10 minutes. The forced apology was still burning in her throat, the taste of accountability bitter and unfamiliar. Crystal Janet repeated more insistently this time. "Do you know who that child is?" The question penetrated Crystal's shock slowly like water seeping through concrete. She looked down at Zara Monroe, who had returned to standing beside Commander Washington's wheelchair with the calm composure of someone who had accomplished exactly what she'd set out to do. Just a small girl in a navy dress, holding a boarding pass and looking like she belonged in any elementary school classroom in America. "That's Zara Monroe." Janet continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow managed to carry the weight of an avalanche. "Her father is Dominic Monroe, CEO of Monroe Global Enterprises, $50 billion under management. Her mother is Dr. Naomi Monroe, the federal prosecutor who took down Senator Richardson last year for corruption." Crystal felt the blood drain from her face as the implications hit her like successive physical blows. The child she had dismissed as irrelevant, the small voice she had tried to silence, belonged to one of the most powerful families in American business and politics. The girl whose intervention she had resented represented more wealth and influence than Crystal would encounter in a dozen lifetimes. And that video, Janet continued gesturing to the phones that were still recording throughout the gate area, is already everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. #GateGate is trending nationally. The airline's corporate communication team is fielding calls from every major news outlet in the country. Crystal's legs gave way slightly, and she gripped the podium for support. In the span of 15 minutes, she had gone from routine gate agent to the face of airline discrimination captured in high-definition video while humiliating a disabled veteran in front of his child defender. The institutional power that had protected her for 12 years was evaporating in real time, replaced by the raw exposure of viral accountability. The video has been shared by Congress members, civil rights organizations, and veteran advocacy groups. Janet continued relentlessly. The airline's stock price is down 3% since the video went live 20 minutes ago. The CEO's office is demanding immediate action, and corporate legal is already preparing for lawsuits. Around the gate area, passengers were experiencing their own moments of realization as word spread through the crowd about Zara's identity. The businessman in 4C was frantically Googling Monroe Global Enterprises on his laptop, his eyes widening as he read about the family's net worth and political connections. The college student was adding context to his live stream for viewers who were just tuning in, explaining who Zara's parents were and why this confrontation was about to become a national news story. "Ma'am," the elderly woman in 2A said, addressing Zara directly with the kind of respectful tone usually reserved for adults, "your parents raised you right. That was beautiful what you just did." Zara accepted the compliment with a small nod, but her attention remained focused on Commander Washington, who was sitting in his wheelchair with tears streaming down his face. Not tears of shame this time, but tears of overwhelming gratitude. In 18 months of struggling with depression and disability and the feeling that his service had been forgotten, no one had defended his honor the way this child had just done. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't know what to say except thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Zara replied, her tone gentle but firm. "Your service speaks for itself. Your sacrifice speaks for itself. Your dignity was never negotiable, regardless of what anyone else chose to believe." Janet Torres was still whispering urgently to Crystal about damage control and corporate response and the need for immediate action, but Crystal wasn't listening anymore. She was watching Zara Monroe walk back toward her seat with the same calm composure she'd shown throughout the entire confrontation, as if forcing public accountability from institutional authority was just another item on her daily checklist. The irony was overwhelming and bitter. Crystal had spent 12 years using her small portion of institutional power to make people feel helpless and diminished. She had targeted passengers who she perceived as vulnerable, who couldn't fight back, who would absorb her cruelty and move on without consequences. And today she had chosen to target two people who represented the exact opposite of powerlessness. Commander Washington carried the moral authority of military service and personal sacrifice. His uniform and medals commanded respect that transcended race and disability, representing values that most Americans held sacred, regardless of their political affiliations. Attacking his legitimacy wasn't just cruel. It was an assault on the idea that service and sacrifice mattered. Zara Monroe carried something even more dangerous to Crystal's worldview, the combination of moral clarity and practical power. She had the confidence that came from being raised to believe her voice mattered, the education to articulate complex ideas clearly, and the family connections to ensure that her words would reach the highest levels of corporate and political authority. Crystal, Janet said, finally her voice carrying the weight of professional finality. "You're suspended immediately pending investigation. Security will escort you from the terminal. Corporate will be in touch about next steps, but honestly, I wouldn't expect good news." The words hit Crystal like the closing of a door that could never be reopened. 12 years of airline employment pension contributions, health insurance, professional identity, all of it disappearing because she had finally encountered someone who refused to accept institutional cruelty as normal operating procedure. As security officers approached to escort her from the terminal, Crystal looked one more time at the scene she had created through her own choices. Commander Washington was being assisted onto the aircraft by crew members who were treating him with the respect and dignity that should have been his from the beginning. Passengers were still recording and commenting and sharing, turning her moment of exposed cruelty into a permanent digital record that would follow her forever. And Zara Monroe was settling into her seat with a book about Thurgood Marshall, already moving on to whatever came next in her day, having accomplished something that would ripple through boardrooms and newsrooms and congressional offices for months to come. The child had won, not through wealth or connections or institutional power, but through the simple, devastating effectiveness of speaking truth to authority without fear. She had forced accountability where none had existed before, created consequences where none had been expected, and proved that individual moral courage could still triumph over institutional protection of cruelty. As Crystal was led away from Gate 23 for the last time, she understood with crystalline clarity that she hadn't just lost her job. She had lost a contest with someone who represented everything she had never learned to value: dignity, courage, and the unshakable belief that justice was worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. The reckoning was complete. The revolution had begun. And it all started with a 9-year-old girl who refused to stay silent when she saw something wrong. Flight 847 to Seattle took off 45 minutes behind schedule, but none of the passengers complained about the delay. They had just witnessed something extraordinary, and the normal frustrations of air travel seemed insignificant compared to the moral drama that had unfolded at Gate 23. Commander Darius Washington found himself in Seat 3A, upgraded without request or explanation by a flight crew that had heard about the confrontation from colleagues on the ground. The flight attendant, a young man named Marcus, with kind eyes and a genuine smile, had personally ensured that Commander Washington was settled comfortably before takeoff. "Sir, it's an honor to have you on board," Marcus had said quietly as he adjusted Commander Washington's wheelchair storage. "My grandfather served in Vietnam, and he taught me that we don't thank our veterans enough. Thank you for your service, and thank you for your sacrifice." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of authentic respect that had been missing from Commander Washington's interactions for months. He felt something loosening in his chest, some knot of pain and shame that had been wound tight since his medical retirement. For the first time since his injury, someone was seeing his uniform and medals and wheelchair as a complete picture of service and sacrifice, not as contradictory elements that needed explanation. 3 rows behind him, Zara Monroe was reading her biography of Thurgood Marshall and occasionally glancing out the window at the cloud formations below. She had returned to her book immediately after boarding, declining interview requests from fellow passengers and maintaining the same calm composure that had characterized her entire intervention at the gate. "Excuse me," said the woman in 12B, leaning across the aisle with obvious curiosity. "That was incredible what you did back there. How did you know what to say? How did you stay so calm?" Zara looked up from her book with polite attention. "My parents taught me that dignity isn't negotiable, and that silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit in that injustice. When I saw Commander Washington being treated with deliberate cruelty, I had a choice to make. I could stay comfortable in my seat and hope someone else would intervene, or I could do what I knew was right." The simplicity of her explanation made it sound obvious, but everyone on the plane understood that what Zara had done required a rare combination of moral clarity and personal courage. Most adults would have found excuses to avoid confronting institutional authority, would have convinced themselves that getting involved would only make things worse. "But weren't you scared?" pressed the woman. "She was an adult with authority. She could have called security on you." Zara considered the question seriously. "I wasn't scared of getting in trouble for doing the right thing. I was more concerned about what would happen to Commander Washington if no one spoke up. The worst thing that could happen to me was some temporary inconvenience. The worst thing that could happen to him was the complete destruction of his dignity in front of 50 strangers." Throughout the cabin, passengers were having similar conversations, processing what they had witnessed and sharing their reactions on social media. The hashtag #GateGate was trending not just nationally but internationally, with millions of people viewing videos of Zara's intervention and Crystal's forced apology. Commander Washington found himself checking his phone with trembling hands as friend requests and messages poured in from fellow veterans who had seen the video. His old teammates from SEAL Team 7 were sharing it with comments like, "That's our commander and proud to have served with you, brother." Veteran advocacy organizations were reaching out to invite him to speak at events and conferences. Sir, the flight attendant, Marcus, was back with a tablet in his hand. "I hope you don't mind, but the captain asked me to show you something." On the screen was a statement from the airline's CEO posted to the company's official social media accounts just minutes after takeoff. "We are appalled by the treatment of Commander Washington at Gate 23 this morning. The employee responsible has been terminated immediately, and we are implementing comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing staff. Commander Washington's service to our country deserves our deepest respect and gratitude, and we failed to provide that today. We will do better." Commander Washington read the statement twice, hardly believing that the humiliation he'd endured just hours ago had transformed into this kind of corporate accountability. The institutional power that had protected Crystal Blake for 12 years had evaporated in the face of viral video and public outrage. "There's more," Marcus said, gently scrolling down to show another statement. This one from the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. "The treatment of Commander Washington is unacceptable and represents exactly the kind of discrimination that prevents many veterans from receiving the respect they've earned. We will be working with airline industry leaders to ensure this never happens again." Senator Patricia Collins, chair of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, had announced hearings on discrimination against disabled veterans in transportation settings. Congressman Michael Rodriguez was drafting legislation requiring bias training for all airline employees. The ripple effects of Zara's intervention were already spreading through the highest levels of government and corporate America. But perhaps the most meaningful message came from an unexpected source, Dr. Naomi Monroe had sent a video message from the congressional hearing where she was testifying, speaking directly to her daughter Zara. "I just saw what happened at the airport. Your father and I are proud of you beyond words. You used your voice to defend someone who couldn't defend himself, and you did it with the kind of grace and courage that changes the world. That's exactly the kind of person we hoped you would become." Zara watched her mother's message with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had acted according to her deepest values and received confirmation that those values were worth defending. She wasn't seeking praise or recognition. She was simply glad that her intervention had made a difference for Commander Washington and potentially for other veterans who might face similar treatment in the future. As the plane began its descent into Seattle, passengers were already planning how they would tell this story to their families and friends. They had witnessed something they would remember for the rest of their lives, a moment when individual moral courage triumphed over institutional cruelty, when a child's clarity cut through adult rationalizations, when justice prevailed because someone refused to stay silent. Commander Washington was looking out the window at the Seattle skyline, thinking about his daughter Jasmine and how proud she would be when she heard about what had happened. For months he'd been dreading this visit, ashamed of his disability and uncertain about his worth. Now he was arriving as something he'd never expected to be again, a symbol of dignity defended and honor restored. The plane touched down gently, and as passengers began to gather their belongings, something extraordinary happened. Without any coordination or announcement, the entire cabin began to applaud. Not for the pilots or the flight crew, but for Commander Washington and Zara Monroe, the veteran and the child who had reminded everyone on board that courage could still triumph over cruelty. The revolution had begun at 30,000 feet, and it was just getting started. Within 48 hours of the video going viral, the dominoes began falling with the swift, inexorable force of genuine accountability finally meeting institutional power. Crystal Blake's termination was just the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape policies across the airline industry and beyond. The FBI opened an investigation into discriminatory practices at the airline after receiving over 10,000 complaints from passengers who had experienced similar treatment. Former gate agents came forward with stories of being pressured to target certain types of passengers, of informal quotas for denied boardings of supervisors, who rewarded employees for being tough on people who looked like they might cause problems. Janet Torres, the supervisor who had tried to manage the crisis, found herself suspended when internal emails surfaced showing that she had received multiple complaints about Crystal Blake's behavior over the years and had consistently failed to take action. The institutional protection that had allowed Crystal to operate with impunity for 12 years was revealed to be part of a broader culture that prioritized operational efficiency over human dignity. Commander Washington received a personal phone call from the airline's CEO offering a formal apology and compensation that he chose to donate to veteran advocacy organizations. More meaningfully, he was invited to join a new advisory committee on accessibility and dignity in air travel, giving him a platform to ensure that other disabled veterans wouldn't face the same humiliation he had endured. "I spent 18 months feeling invisible," he said during his first television interview, sitting in his dress blues with his medals gleaming under the studio lights. "But Zara Monroe saw me when I needed to be seen most. She reminded me that my service mattered, that my dignity wasn't negotiable, and that there are still people in this world who will stand up for what's right, even when it's not convenient." The interview was watched by over 12 million people, including Dr. Naomi Monroe, who was back in her Washington office after testifying before Congress about prison reform. She watched her daughter's name mentioned alongside discussions of moral courage and social justice, feeling a pride that went beyond typical parental satisfaction. Zara had internalized every lesson about dignity and accountability that they had tried to teach her, and she had applied those lessons in a moment of genuine moral crisis. Dominic Monroe was in a board meeting in New York when his assistant handed him a tablet showing the latest coverage of what media outlets were calling the Gate 23 incident. The video had been viewed over 50 million times across all platforms, making it one of the most watched examples of individual courage in recent memory. "Your daughter is remarkable," said Eleanor Richardson, the board chair of one of Monroe Global's largest holdings. "That level of moral clarity and composure at her age is extraordinary. You should be very proud." "We are," Dominic replied simply, though inside he was marveling at how Zara had managed to channel everything they had taught her about responsibility and justice into such a powerful moment of intervention. She had used her privilege exactly the way they had hoped she would, not for personal advantage, but to defend someone who needed defending. The legal consequences for Crystal Blake extended beyond termination. Commander Washington filed a civil rights lawsuit with the support of the ACLU, seeking not monetary damages, but policy changes that would protect other veterans from similar treatment. Crystal found herself at the center of a federal investigation into discriminatory practices, facing potential criminal charges for violation of civil rights under color of authority. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the wave of policy changes that swept through the transportation industry. The Department of Transportation announced new regulations requiring bias training for all airline employees, with specific protections for veterans, disabled passengers, and other vulnerable populations. Airlines that failed to meet the new standards would face substantial fines and potential loss of operating licenses. The changes went beyond airlines. Airport security agencies, rental car companies, and public transportation systems all announced enhanced training programs and accountability measures designed to prevent the kind of institutional cruelty that had been exposed at Gate 23. "What that little girl did changed everything," said Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, a disabled Army veteran who had faced similar treatment at airports across the country. "She proved that you don't need to be big or powerful or connected to make a difference. You just need to be willing to speak up when you see something wrong." Zara's intervention had become a case study in moral courage taught in ethics classes and leadership seminars across the country. The video was analyzed not just for its immediate impact, but for what it revealed about the power of individual action to create broader change. Dr. Amanda Foster, a professor of social psychology at Georgetown University, wrote extensively about the incident. "What we saw at Gate 23 was a perfect example of how institutional protection of discriminatory behavior can be shattered by someone who refuses to accept that cruelty is normal." Zara Monroe didn't have any special authority or power beyond her moral clarity, but that was enough to force accountability where none had existed before. The incident also sparked broader conversations about the responsibility of bystanders to intervene when they witness injustice. Psychology researchers documented what they called the Zara effect, a measurable increase in people's willingness to speak up when they saw discrimination or abuse occurring in public spaces. She reminded us that silence is a choice, said Dr. Robert Chen, who studied bystander intervention at Columbia University. Most people convince themselves that someone else will handle the situation, that they don't have the right to get involved, that intervention will only make things worse. But what Zara demonstrated is that individual moral courage can be more powerful than institutional authority when it's applied with clarity and purpose. The foundation that Dominic and Naomi Monroe established in response to the incident provided funding for bias training programs, veteran advocacy organizations, and legal defense funds for people facing discrimination. They named it the Dignity Defense Foundation, with a mission statement that reflected their daughter's simple but powerful philosophy. Dignity is not negotiable, and silence in the face of injustice makes us all complicit. Within 6 months, the foundation had distributed over $10 million in grants to organizations working to combat discrimination in transportation, healthcare, housing, and employment. Zara served on the Youth Advisory Board, helping to identify programs that would make the biggest difference for vulnerable populations. The revolution that had begun with a 9-year-old girl's refusal to stay silent was transforming into a movement that would protect countless others from the kind of institutional cruelty that had once been considered just part of doing business. 6 months after the incident at Gate 23, Commander Darius Washington stood at the podium in the Russell Senate Office Building looking out at a packed hearing room where senators, veterans, advocates, and civil rights leaders had gathered to hear his testimony about discrimination in air travel. His daughter Jasmine sat in the front row wearing her medical school uniform and beaming with pride. She had graduated summa cum laude and was now in her first year at Johns Hopkins, specializing in trauma surgery for veterans. The visit that had begun with such humiliation had transformed their relationship, bringing them closer than they had been since before his deployment. Senator Collins. Members of the committee. Darius began his voice strong and clear. 18 months ago, I was a man who felt invisible. My injury had convinced me that my service no longer mattered, that my dignity was negotiable, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps of respect people chose to give me. He paused, looking directly at the cameras that were broadcasting his testimony live. But a 9-year-old girl named Zara Monroe reminded me that dignity is never negotiable. She showed me that silence in the face of cruelty makes us all complicit in that cruelty. And she proved that individual moral courage can still triumph over institutional power when it's applied with clarity and purpose. The hearing room was completely silent as Darius continued his testimony, describing not just what had happened at Gate 23, but the broader pattern of discrimination that disabled veterans faced in their daily lives. He spoke about the assumptions people made about their capabilities, about the bureaucratic barriers that made simple tasks unnecessarily difficult, about the subtle and overt ways that society reminded them they were no longer considered fully valuable. But I'm not here today as a victim, Darius concluded. I'm here as someone who has learned that speaking truth to power is the only way to create the change that protects others from experiencing what I went through. Zara Monroe gave me back my voice, and I intend to use it. The applause that followed his testimony was thunderous, but more importantly, it led to concrete action. The committee passed unanimous bipartisan legislation requiring comprehensive disability awareness training for all transportation industry employees, with specific protections for veterans and accountability measures for violations. Meanwhile, in Seattle, Zara Monroe was settling into her new life as a 10-year-old who had accidentally become a symbol of moral courage. Her grandmother's house had become a gathering place for civil rights activists, veteran advocates, and journalists who wanted to understand how a child had managed to force such dramatic change through simple moral clarity. She doesn't think what she did was special, her grandmother, Dr. Zara Monroe, told a reporter from the Washington Post. She sees it as basic human decency. When you see someone being hurt, you help them. When you see injustice, you speak up. Her parents raised her to believe that privilege comes with responsibility, and she took that lesson seriously. Zara herself was remarkably unchanged by the attention and acclaim. She continued reading her biography of Thurgood Marshall, continued excelling in her advanced academic programs, and continued applying the lessons her parents had taught her about dignity and accountability to every situation she encountered. The friendship that had developed between Zara and Commander Washington was perhaps the most meaningful outcome of their shared experience. They exchanged letters regularly with Darius, sharing stories from his advocacy work, and Zara offering insights that continued to amaze him with their depth and clarity. "You taught me something I had forgotten," Darius wrote in one letter. "You reminded me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being willing to act according to your values even when you are afraid. You were probably scared when you stood up to that gate agent, but you did it anyway because it was right." Zara's response was characteristically thoughtful. "I wasn't really scared of her. I was scared of staying silent and then regretting it for the rest of my life. My mother always says that we can live with the consequences of doing the right thing, but we can't live with the consequences of knowing we had the chance to help someone and chose not to." The correspondence between them had been compiled into a book by a publisher who recognized the educational value of their exchange. Letters on Courage became a bestseller with proceeds donated to the Dignity Defense Foundation and veteran advocacy organizations. Crystal Blake had largely disappeared from public view after her termination and the civil rights lawsuit. She had been forced to declare bankruptcy due to legal costs and had relocated to a small town in Ohio where she worked part-time at a grocery store. The institutional power that had once protected her cruelty was gone, replaced by the social consequences of having her behavior exposed to millions of people. Some observers expressed sympathy for her complete fall from professional status, but Zara's response to questions about forgiveness was characteristically clear. "I hope she learns from what happened and becomes a better person. But accountability isn't cruel. It's necessary. People who abuse their authority need to face consequences, or they'll keep abusing it." The broader impact of the Gate 23 incident continued to ripple through American society in ways both large and small. Videos of the confrontation were shown in diversity training sessions across corporate America. Business schools added case studies about the incident to their ethics curricula. Military academies used Zara's intervention as an example of moral courage in leadership courses. But perhaps the most significant change was harder to measure: the shift in public consciousness about the power of individual action to create broader change. Countless people had shared their own stories of witnessing discrimination and choosing to intervene, crediting Zara's example with giving them the courage to speak up. "She showed us that you don't need permission to do the right thing," said Dr. Michael Torres, a professor of ethics at Harvard Business School. "You don't need special training or authority or institutional backing. You just need moral clarity and the willingness to act on your convictions." Commander Washington had found his purpose again, not just as a veteran advocate, but as living proof that individual dignity could be restored even after institutional cruelty had tried to destroy it. His speaking engagements around the country drew standing ovations, but more importantly, they led to concrete policy changes that protected other vulnerable populations from similar treatment. "Zara Monroe saved more than my dignity that day at Gate 23, he said during one particularly memorable speech. "She saved my faith in the possibility that individual courage can still triumph over institutional power. She reminded me that heroes come in all sizes, and sometimes the smallest voices carry the most moral authority." The healing that had begun with a 9-year-old girl's refusal to stay silent had transformed both their lives and countless others, proving that dignity defended is dignity restored, and that moral courage is contagious when it's expressed with clarity and purpose. 1 year after the incident at Gate 23, Zara Monroe found herself in a familiar position witnessing injustice and deciding whether to intervene. She was traveling alone again this time from Seattle to Los Angeles for a speaking engagement at UCLA about youth advocacy and moral courage. At Gate 47 in Seattle, Tacoma International Airport, she watched as a gate agent questioned the documentation of an elderly Filipino veteran who was using a walker and trying to board with priority assistance. The veteran, soft-spoken and clearly intimidated by the agent's aggressive questioning, was being asked to provide additional proof of his military service despite having valid documentation. But this time, Zara wasn't alone in her response. As she stood up to intervene, 3 other passengers also rose from their seats. A businessman, a college student, and an elderly woman all moved toward the podium simultaneously, each prepared to defend the veteran's dignity. The gate agent, seeing multiple witnesses preparing to document and challenge her behavior, immediately changed her approach and processed the veteran's boarding with appropriate respect. "Thank you for being willing to speak up," the businessman said to Zara as they returned to their seats. "I saw what happened to that veteran last year and decided I never wanted to be someone who stayed silent when I could help." It was a small moment, but it represented something profound, the cultural shift that had emerged from Zara's intervention at Gate 23. Individual acts of moral courage had inspired others to find their own courage, creating a ripple effect that was changing how people responded to witnessed injustice. The data supported this observation. The Department of Transportation reported a 60% decrease in discrimination complaints against airline personnel in the year following the implementation of new training requirements. More significantly, passenger intervention in discriminatory incidents had increased by over 300%, suggesting that people were no longer willing to be passive observers of institutional cruelty. Commander Washington had become the face of veteran advocacy, serving on multiple advisory boards and speaking regularly about the intersection of disability, military service, and civil rights. His friendship with Zara had evolved into a mentorship that benefited them both, with her moral clarity complementing his lived experience in ways that strengthened both of their advocacy efforts. "She taught me that age doesn't determine wisdom," Darius said during his keynote speech at the National Veterans Convention. "Sometimes the youngest voice in the room is the one with the clearest vision of what justice looks like." Zara Monroe saw my humanity when others chose to see only stereotypes, and that changed everything. The Dignity Defense Foundation had grown into a major force for civil rights advocacy funding, legal challenges to discriminatory practices, and supporting individuals who faced retaliation for speaking up against injustice. Zara continued to serve on the Youth Advisory Board, helping to identify young advocates who were creating change in their own communities. Her parents watched with pride as their daughter applied the lessons they had taught her to increasingly complex situations. She had testified before Congress about youth perspectives on civil rights, spoken at conferences about moral courage in leadership, and continued to intervene directly when she witnessed injustice occurring. We raised her to believe that privilege comes with responsibility. Dr. Naomi Monroe explained to a reporter from Time magazine, which had named Zara one of their most influential young people for the 2nd consecutive year. But she internalized that lesson more completely than we ever imagined possible. She doesn't see moral courage as exceptional. She sees it as basic human responsibility. The academic study of Zara's intervention had produced insights that were reshaping how psychologists and sociologists understood bystander behavior and moral development. Dr. Amanda Foster's research on the Zara effect had documented measurable changes in people's willingness to intervene when they witnessed discrimination, suggesting that moral courage could indeed be contagious under the right circumstances. What she demonstrated at Gate 23 was that institutional authority is only as powerful as our willingness to accept it, Dr. Foster concluded in her widely cited research. When someone refuses to be intimidated by bureaucratic power and speaks truth with moral clarity, it creates space for others to find their own courage. The long-term impact extended far beyond transportation policy. Corporate America had implemented comprehensive bias training programs across multiple industries. Educational institutions were teaching courses on moral courage and bystander intervention. Military leadership academies were using the Gate 23 video as a case study in individual responsibility and institutional accountability. But for Zara herself, the most important outcome was simpler and more personal. She had learned that individual action could create change, that moral clarity could triumph over institutional power, and that dignity was indeed non-negotiable when people were willing to defend it. As her plane took off from Seattle, climbing into clouds that reflected the afternoon sun like golden promises, Zara opened a new book about Eleanor Roosevelt and began reading about another woman who had refused to accept injustice as normal. The revolution that had begun with a 9-year-old's refusal to stay silent was continuing, carried forward by countless others who had learned that courage was contagious and that individual action could indeed change the world. Commander Washington, watching the sunset from his apartment in Durham, felt a peace that had been absent from his life since his injury. Tomorrow, he would speak to a group of newly retired veterans about finding purpose after military service, and he would tell them what a 9-year-old girl had taught him about dignity and courage and the power of being seen. The story that had begun with institutional cruelty had transformed into something beautiful, a reminder that individual moral courage could still triumph over authority when it was applied with clarity and purpose. And somewhere in the space between one person's willingness to speak and another person's courage to listen, justice had found a way to prevail. 6 months later, Congress passed the Dignity in Travel Act, requiring comprehensive bias training for all transportation industry employees and establishing federal protections for veterans, disabled passengers, and other vulnerable populations. The law was named in honor of Commander Washington's service and Zara Monroe's courage, ensuring that their moment of moral reckoning would continue protecting others for generations to come. The revolution had begun with 2 words: "Don't talk to him like that." But it had grown into something larger than anyone could have imagined. Proof that individual conscience, clearly expressed and courageously defended, could still change the world. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts about how small acts of courage can create large changes. Together we can build a world where dignity is truly non-negotiable and where silence in the face of injustice is no longer an option.